Welcome once again to The Close Read. This is our regular Claremont Review of Books podcast, where it's my pleasure to sit down with various authors from each issue of the CRB, of the latest issue, and just discuss some themes that are raised by the essays that we publish. There's always more to say, more to ask when we put these pieces out. And today I'm particularly excited to be joined by Dr. Leonard Sax, MD, PhD, to talk about his review, The Ambiguity of the Evidence, from our latest issue, the fall 2021 issue. You can find it online. You might already have it in your mailbox. This is a review of The Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. He's a philosopher, historian of science, and also a scientist himself who's written at some length about the growing evidence, or at least the growing openness to the suggestion that there may be a God in the scientific community. Meyer writes about this kind of long-standing idea that there's some sort of war between science and religion, which in many ways is really a confection of the late 19th century. And his book is just laying out some of the ways in which physics and biology especially are kind of nudging in the direction that perhaps a creator mind, a transcendent mind, is a viable scientific hypothesis, or a viable hypothesis full stop about how the world came to be the way that it is. It's a fascinating book. This is a fascinating review. Dr. Sax is a widely published and read author on a number of topics, especially the sort of intersection between biology and psychology. His books, Why Gender Matters, Boys Adrift, Girls on the Edge, The Collapse of Parenting, all highly successful. His website, leonardsax.com, is where you can learn more about him. He's been continuously certified by the American Board of Family Medicine, and he got his PhD in psychology and his MD from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Sax, welcome to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I'm going to read, first of all, just from your review so that folks can get a sense, if they haven't already read it, for the kinds of issues you're raising here and what you're talking about from Meyer's book, and then we will discuss. So here's one of my favorite paragraphs from the review. You write, "Today it is clear that the genetic code is a code, a sophisticated marvel of information processing nanotechnology, whereby three-letter nucleotide codons are translated into amino acids, which are assembled into proteins. Even if scientists could succeed in showing how the prebiotic soup could generate a rich mixture of nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA and DNA, such a mixture would be roughly equivalent to a bucket full of English letters. The unanswered question is how a random scoop into the bucket could ever generate the equivalent of Hamlet or Huckleberry Finn. Even the simplest living cell contains more than 400 genes, each composed of dozens or hundreds of codons, and every one of them essential to life. That is, if any one of those genes is deleted experimentally, the cell will die. No theory currently on offer satisfactorily explains the origin of this genetic information. Researchers have responded with vague ideas such as self-organization and prebiotic natural selection, but as Nobel laureate in physiology Christian de Duve noted, such theories presuppose what is to be explained in the first place, namely, where did the information come from? Now, I'm not a scientist, Dr. Sax, but I am. It has often struck me that there is a curious disconnect between what you call the ambiguity of the evidence, which is to say the available empirical facts which science discovers, and the very real possibility that, an explanation for them might be a creator God, and this kind of atmospheric sense of doubt. And this is probably more among the general public than scientists, but that people in general just have this kind of vague idea that they've inhaled from the atmosphere, that science and religion cannot coexist, that you have to have one or the other. Do you think that that's changing, and where does it come from in the first place?
No, I don't think it's changing at all, and I would not exempt the scientific community. I like your choice of the word atmospheric. It is indeed atmospheric. The notion that the God hypothesis, the hypothesis that God might have had something to do with this, is utterly out of bounds within the scientific community, just as it is in the mainstream culture. In my review, I was actually hoping, when I started writing it, to make the analogy with Copernicus. I just didn't have room. But I think your listeners might be interested in that analogy. I'd like to explore that if I may.
Please do, yeah.
Back in the 1500s, in the early 1500s, the dominant consensus, the atmospheric, the atmosphere of scientific investigation at that time was that the best understanding of the universe was the Ptolemaic understanding, namely that the Earth was the center of the universe, with the sun orbiting the Earth. And the match with empirical observation was very good. Scientists of that time had invented all kinds of weird and more or less untestable explanations to account for the movements of the celestial objects, the planets, the sun, and so forth. Nicholas Copernicus said, look, there's an awful lot of arbitrary invention in this Ptolemaic worldview, which is put there just to fit the evidence, but which really is not clean or well motivated. Let's consider a different hypothesis, that the sun is the center and that the Earth orbits the sun. Wow, look how much cleaner that makes things. Look how, now at the time that Copernicus wrote, the Copernican theory was not a better match to the evidence at all. The telescope had not yet been invented. Galileo was still in the future. And one could say, well, the evidence is ambiguous. It could support Ptolemy's view, or it could support the Copernican view. What Dr. Meyer has done in his book is formally analogous to what Nicholas Copernicus did. He has said, look, the contemporary scientific community is literally inventing universes, other universes that we can't observe, because that's the only way they can accommodate the extraordinary fine-tuning of the elemental constants that govern this universe, which are fine-tuned to an astonishing precision in order for life to emerge. And again, the atmosphere, the current scientific atmosphere is that, well, there must be billions upon billions of other universes which instantiate every other possible configuration of these dozen or so elemental constants. And we cannot, in principle, observe these other universes because they're in other universes, but we assume they must be there because that's the only way that we can explain why these dozen or so elemental constants are so extraordinarily finely tuned to permit the existence of life as we know it. What Dr. Meyer has done is, as I said, very similar in concept to what Copernicus did, which is to say, look, yeah, the current scientific consensus can accommodate the observations, but only by invoking these extraordinary creations of other universes, which are in principle untestable, unobservable. And what has been most disappointing to me is that Dr. Meyer's book has gone unnoticed. The Claremont Review of Books is the only major publication to publish a review. No other mainstream media, right, left, or center, has even mentioned it. I think it's a very important book. And were it not for the Claremont Review of Books, there would be no thoughtful published review that readers could consult before deciding whether to read it.
Well, you make that's a remarkable comparison. The multiverse theory that Meyer explores in the book was one of the most sort of striking series of chapters. I think he compares it to this Alice in Wonderland, believe 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right.
and when you put that up with your Copernicus analogy, another name that comes to mind for me is Thomas Kuhn, who's famous for kind of arguing that
structure of scientific revolution, paradigm shift.
That's right. I mean, in brief and simplistically, right, this idea that the kinds of questions you ask and the sorts of hypotheses you even think to put forward are conditioned by a governing set of, convictions that you kind of bring to science. from the beginning. And that this multiverse hypothesis is a wonderful example of it, because it involves essentially constructing a number of, out of both string theory and inflationary cosmology, there's a number of sort of presuppositions, just because the other explanation, which is that these laws of the universe are fine-tuned purposefully to support life, is simply unacceptable. It's just out of the question. And it is remarkable to me that, as you say, this has not gotten attention. I mean, even to tear it apart, right? I mean, you would think that if this is a major challenge to the governing sort of paradigm of scientific research, you would at least see it like pilloried in the New York Review of Books or wherever. Why do you think that it's being ignored?
Copernicus was pretty much ignored, and his book certainly did not become accepted for almost 100 years after his death. I think it is actually you can read in the blogs why people don't want to review it. They feel that even reviewing the book would give it a respectability that they do not want to lend. And for a mainstream reviewer to review the book would put that reviewer in jeopardy by even considering whether the God hypothesis might have any plausibility. Even to consider that would open you to a great question.
Remarkable. Yeah. I'm wondering now about, since this is effectively, deletion by silence, or whatever you want to call it, right? This sort of effort not to engage because you might legitimate what's going on. I mean, we see this, I think, in all sorts of places, and not just in science. We see this with somebody like, Joe Rogan or the Daily Wire, these sort of renegade media companies that spring up, and, sometimes they get attacked, but often they are simply excluded from the picture that is presented in polite society of possible people that you might engage with or discuss. And I'd like to ask, actually, in turn, about some of the people that you mentioned in this review and that Meyer brings up in the book, who are themselves scientists and are, in fact, raising the question, well, couldn't we at least propose that mind is a way to deal with this, that God is a way to deal with this evidence? One of the quotes that struck me from the book is from this guy, John Polkinghorne, who's an English theoretical physicist, Anglican priest. Meyer quotes Polkinghorne as saying, "We are living in an age where there is a great revival of natural theology taking place. That revival of natural theology is taking place not on the whole among theologians who have lost their nerve in that area, but among the scientists." That phrase, "lost their nerve," raises for me this sense that we've been talking about, that people get shy to even suggest that maybe God is a concept that could be relevant to science or could explain scientific fact, because of this atmosphere, right? That it's unsophisticated. It's simply, we don't want to legitimate it. We don't want to engage it. And so theologians have lost their nerve over this. And I wonder if there's a sort of corollary here, not just in the scientific community, but in the religious community. I mean, do you find that theologians and clerics and priests are also kind of having a hard time really being bold about putting forward the God hypothesis?
Well, I'm not knowledgeable about trends in modern theology, so I'm not the best qualified to answer that question. But I would assert that question is beside the point. Whether or not theologians regard the God hypothesis as an explanation for findings in physics and cosmology, I don't think is really the point. I think the point is, do physicists and cosmologists regard the God hypothesis as worthy of consideration? And my reading of that is that they do not. Despite the optimism that you applied in your question, I would argue that Meyer's book at this point has not had any discernible impact. And I think that's a shame. But I take consolation in the fact that the treatise by Nicholas Copernicus also had no discernible impact in the first 2 years after its publication. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "Some are born posthumously." referring to himself. Nietzsche himself had no readership prior to his collapse in January 1889. And Meyer's book has not earned the readership it deserves. But that's not because of any defect in the book, but because our mainstream culture is saddled with blinders that does not allow it to see anything outside of its narrow worldview, constrained by its own materialist assumptions.
I'm glad you mentioned Nietzsche, because you reference him to great effect in this essay. You begin with a quote from
Yes.
Daybreak, which I found rather chilling. This is about the effects of evolution, not so much on scientific progress as on man's sense of himself in the universe. Nietzsche writes, "Formerly one sought the feeling of the grandeur of man. By pointing to his divine origin, this has now become a forbidden way, for at its portal stands the ape, together with other dreadful beasts, grinning knowingly as if to say, no further in this direction." Yeah. It's a great line. And speaks to, Nietzsche's skill as a writer as well as an observer, I think he was ruthless in observing the implications of what people were saying, even when they themselves didn't realize it. This was the great God is dead observation, is that people didn't even understand all the time that they had already laid the groundwork for the horrors of the 20th century. And you then return, I think, indirectly to this idea when you mention, Meyer draws in his experience counseling troubled undergraduates as they face life's biggest questions. If you believe the current default hypothesis that life is just a random accident signifying nothing, then that belief has existential consequences. You are, among other things, a psychologist and a counselor of young people. Is that something that sort of chimes with your experience as well? Have you found materialism and sort of nihilist philosophy to affect the emotional lives of young people?
Absolutely. And that's an area where I do feel confident speaking, because that's what I do. I meet with young people, and I can tell you that the assumptions that underlie our current culture are toxic to young people. The assumption is that human life has no meaning. And this, of course, is the point that Nietzsche was making, that if Nietzsche, as I said in the review, was the first philosopher seriously to explore the existential implications of Darwin. If that's all there is, if life is just a random accident, then to ask for the meaning in a human life is as silly as asking for the meaning in the life of a squirrel or a cockroach or a jellyfish. We are just accidental concatenations of atoms. Our life has no meaning. When we die, it's over. And therefore, the only point is to have a good time as best you can for as long as you can. And that philosophy, that perspective, is utterly and profoundly toxic to human flourishing. It's not what humans are made for. And to the extent that a young person absorbs that, they will despair. And we've all seen the documentation of the rising tide of anxiety, depression among young women, the growing proportion of young men who would rather sit in their bedrooms playing video games like Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty rather than engage the real world. As I argue in my books, Boys Adrift and Girls on the Edge, in both cases, these young people are responding to that void where a spirit, a soul, ought to be. But there is such a thing as a spiritual life. And if you don't nurture that, if you don't respect that, if you don't acknowledge it, then you end up with despair or disengagement. And that's exactly what we're seeing among young Americans right now. Again, Dr. Meyer does not offer a proof in his book. But just as Copernicus could not claim in 1540 that his hypothesis was a better fit to the evidence, it was not. Nor can Dr. Meyer prove that the God hypothesis is true. Maybe there are billions upon billions of other universes that we cannot observe that instantiate every possible concatenation of the elemental constants of the universe. But as Dr. Meyer does convey, the God hypothesis is at least as plausible the evidence is ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
It can support the God hypothesis. It does support the God hypothesis at least as well as it supports the materialist hypothesis. So it's up to you to choose. You have to choose. You cannot evade that choice. The evidence does not compel you to adopt the materialist assumption or the God hypothesis. The evidence is remarkably balanced. You have to choose. And that can actually be inspiring because, as you mentioned, that atmosphere we live in that assumes that life is meaningless, that there is no God. And when you explain to a young person, well, actually, that's not the case. That's a materialist assumption. You don't have to share that assumption. The evidence is ambiguous and it supports the God hypothesis, at least as well as it supports the materialist assumption. That can be liberating for that young person who has accepted the materialist culture.
Right, right. I mean, one of the things that makes it an atmospheric assumption so pernicious, and this is an ancient observation, is that you actually can believe it without ever having thought about it, right? Without ever having argued for it, and I suppose that in some sense, an implication of what you're saying is that if it's beside the point whether theologians read Meyer, it may not be beside the point whether young people read Meyer and people, who are not necessarily scientific experts. I mean, there's also, I think, an element of this, which is our expertism. We've discussed this, I think, a lot in public lately, that, we have this worship of experts, and folks feel as if they don't have 10 different degrees, if they haven't, studied astrophysics at a postgraduate level, then they're not actually qualified to address questions of ultimate meaning, right? That actually it's only people who are sort of scientists bound up in this materialist assumption who have any authority or standing to speak on this issue. Is there a way, and I'm just spitballing here, is there a way to snap people out of that kind of hypnosis, this sense that they just, they have no control over what they believe? I ask you, I suppose, as a psychologist and somebody that might be able to, to reach people where others can't.
Well, I do encourage people to take up that responsibility. I don't really agree with your claim, if I understood you correctly, that people are today increasingly prone to defer to experts. I think, if anything, that is less true than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago. I think, and that may or may not be a good thing, but I think that now one of the effects of the web has been that anybody can create a page, anyone can claim to be an expert, and kids searching among different sites online really don't know that PhD professor of physics is actually perhaps better qualified than the blogger or the TikTok video that they saw. And I think young people are actually less prone to defer to experts, which may be a good thing, because I do think that our quote unquote leading universities in this country, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and the like, have let us down. I think that they are coasting on the laurels that they earned in previous generations, where they did claim to be, and in some sense did strive to be, pursuing the truth. I think increasingly the leading universities are indoctrinating kids into a political dogma, and the pursuit of truth, wherever it might lead, can now get you in a lot of trouble. You mentioned my books about gender. In my book, Why Gender Matters, I present the evidence that male and female are biological realities, not social constructs, that profoundly influence how we hear, see, and smell. Those differences are hardwired and found across different species. But I can tell you that if you make that claim at Harvard, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, at University of Texas, Austin, you may be denounced as a bigot. And there is no interest in pursuing the truth, and an astonishing lack of curiosity. So the tendency among young people now to discount the experts may not be a bad thing, because I think the experts, many of them, are letting us down.
Right. Right. No, it's intriguing. I mean, we've been discussing, I think, this whole half hour or so, we've been discussing the kind of interplay between the projection of itself that elite society puts forward, right? This kind of immutable authority, this governing atmosphere that you're able to create from the high places of culture. And these doubts, not only the dissatisfaction that the governing materialist philosophy creates in people, but also its incongruity with the evidence, at least in its present strident form, right? That the evidence, as you say, is ambiguous and can support something more theological. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, you began by mentioning the origin of life and evolution. Mm-hmm. Claremont Review of Books a few years back published a review by David Galerter of Dr. Meyer's previous book, Darwin's Doubt, which presented some of the huge problems confronting neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And David Galerter is a professor of computer science at Yale. And merely by virtue of reviewing the book in Claremont Review of Books, even though he didn't agree with a lot of what Dr. Meyer said, David Galerter was pilloried because, again, one of the atmospheric assumptions, if you like, of the, quote, leading American universities is that the theory of evolution cannot be questioned, cannot be seriously questioned. If you question it, you must support Donald Trump. You're outside the pale. And there's a very funny quote that David Meyer describes when a professor of biology from evolution, when a professor of biology from China was giving a speech on Darwinian evolutionary theory and pointed out the problems. In speaking here in the United States, his audience was horrified. And they said, how can you question Darwinian evolution? And he said, well, I'm from China. In China, we're allowed to question Darwin. We're just not allowed to question the government. Here in the United States, you're allowed to question the government, but you're not allowed to question Darwin. And I thought that was a very insightful comment.
Absolutely. Well, it is the kind of soft power, if we could even call it soft at this point, that cultural authorities exert. I mean, we call it cancel culture, but I think it's much deeper and bigger than that, as you are indicating. It's not just that you might lose your job or you might be hounded or pilloried. It's that just raising certain questions invites not simply disagreement or debate or dispute, but fury and ad hominem attacks. I mean, I'm sure that's something you've experienced also as a realist about gender. I mean,
yes.
That you kind of began writing on those topics before it became quite so verboten to raise those issues. Have you found it heating up for you, even in the time that you've been writing on those?
Oh,
issues?
absolutely. And I absolutely have been canceled. I've had invitations withdrawn because I have asserted that male and female are biological realities and not mere social constructs. Right. Again, that was not really controversial 20 years ago when I started writing on this topic, but it is intensely controversial today. So I am not optimistic about the direction of the American mainstream. And I'm increasingly sympathetic to people like Rod Dreher, who say, look, the culture is going in the wrong direction. We need to hunker down. And, I took a 5-year sabbatical to visit schools across the United States because I was so excited by what I was learning in the schools about how to get boys excited about poetry, how to get girls excited about computer science. I thought, boy, when I share this with school leaders and school boards, they're going to be excited. It was an utterly dispiriting effort because I learned that American education is not primarily data-driven. It is driven by politics. And most school leaders in the public sector are not at all interested in what the evidence shows, but are instead very much driven by their politics. And so I withdrew from that and I went back to being a full-time clinician. And now when I meet with schools or meet with families, I'll say, look, you and I can't change the school district. We can't change the government, but we can change this family. We can change this one school. Let's focus on what we can do. And that gives some encouragement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you are listening to The Close Read, a podcast of the Claremont Review of Books, and we're discussing The Ambiguity of the Evidence, which is Dr. Sax's review of Dr. Meyer in the fall 2021 issue. You can find it at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com or in your Dead Tree copy if that's already been mailed to you. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Sax's work, you can go to leonardsax.com. He's got a newsletter. He's got several books, as I mentioned, and a number of other things as well. You can reach out to him personally. Thank you so much, Dr. Sax, for joining us.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Close Read, a Claremont Review of Books podcast and a production of the Claremont Institute. Our publisher is Ryan Williams. Our producer is Jake Gannon, and I'm your host, Spencer Clavin. Thanks to Benjamin Squirett for our music. If you liked this episode and you'd like to hear more in-depth interviews based on the Claremont Review of Books, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on all major platforms. And if you'd like to support us, we encourage you to leave a 5-star review on iTunes. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you again next time.